Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. Donald Trump arrives in Milwaukee for the Republican National Congress after surviving an assassination attempt. The Secret Service protecting the former president now facing intense scrutiny and investigations. President Biden calls for national unity in a rare Oval Office address, urging Americans to resolve their differences with ballots, not bullets.
There's no place in America for this kind of violence, for any violence ever. Period. No exceptions. We can't allow this violence to be normalized.
The dollar strengthens, Treasury futures fall as the shooting increases bets on Trump winning in November. We bring you the market reaction as the Trump trade heats up. So the assassination attempt on the former US president and, of course, the Republican candidate for those November votes has adjusted the moves across these markets, and that is primarily where the lens is. We check in right now on European futures after the gains of last week, more than 2% benchmark across the European stock 600 last week, but European futures now pointing to losses of just shy of 0.6%. The FTSE 100 here in the UK looking at losses of around 17 points, pointing lower by 0.2%. S&P futures in the US, though, pointing to a brighter session, gains of 0.2%. NASDAQ futures looking to add 64 points. Let's flip the board and look cross-asset because that Trump trade reaction is being seen, as we said in the headlines, on the US dollar and, of course, in treasuries as well. Not trading yet because Japan is closed, but when those come online, you can expect yields up, treasuries down. We'll see how that adjusts from the front end to the back end. That's the picture on futures when it comes to treasuries then. A little bit of pressure coming through. The Bloomberg dollar index, though, is bid up 0.1%, and you're seeing that pressure on the paired currencies versus the US dollar. Bitcoin getting a boost as well on expectations that if President Trump does win in November, that will be supportive for crypto. 62,608, up 4% so far in the session for Bitcoin. Gold at 2,411, currently flat. Now, the dollar, US futures and Bitcoin, as we've mentioned, higher this morning, while Treasury futures are lower after the shooting, of course, reinforced those bets that Trump's chances of winning have increased. Let's bring in our MLive strategist, Mark Cranfield, then for the market take, of course, on the momentous news out of the weekend and, of course, that assassination attempt. How markets are adjusting to this. Mark, talk us through the dollar moves that we've seen around these Trump trades then.
We've certainly seen a little bit of strength for the US dollar this morning. And that, as you say, that's partly because the implication is that US yields, particularly in the longer end, will be a bit higher when the markets do start trading cash bonds shortly in London. But really, currency traders are much more interested in what happens at the short end of the curve, the 1 year and the 2 year part of the curve. And their yields have been coming down quite nicely recently. Jerome Powell is speaking at the beginning of the week. He's got the tailwind behind him from a soft inflation report. Bloomberg Economics think that the core PCE will be 2.5% when it prints later this week. That all leads into the Fed meeting. From here, currency traders are going to be much more interested in what short-term yields do, and they're mostly heading lower. So any bit of strength you see in the US dollar is likely to be temporary. It's not going to last too long. You throw in the Japanese part of the equation as well. We saw some suspected intervention last week. They've got the dollar yen heading a bit lower. Still got the Bank of Japan meeting to come. They probably want to push their advantage before we get to that central bank meeting at the end of the month as well. So all in all, the conditions are ripe for the dollar to be a little bit lower. It might go up a touch today, but it probably won't last too long because the tailwind for lower yields in the US, higher yields in Japan is there, and that's what's really driving the short-term moves in the major currencies.
Mark, what else are you looking at? There's been a lot of focus in terms of the moves across the yield curve, and you've talked about those and how those play in to that, as you describe it, temporary strength for the greenback. What else are you watching for in terms of the moves around the Trump trade and how markets adjust to the politics of the US?
Well, probably the steepening of the Treasury yield curve. That's the one that's probably can have some legs because it's also supported by what the Federal Reserve is doing as well. So if you think back to 2016, initially that steepening of the curve had a lot to do with the fact that the Republican Party won all three parts of the US Parliament. They won the presidency, the Congress and the Senate. That gave them the leeway to cut taxes quickly. It's not the same situation this way around, but the Federal Reserve is starting to lower interest rates, or they will be soon. Last time they were raising interest rates, but that trade can still work, and it's coming from an inverted curve as well, which makes it easier for traders. You also mentioned cryptocurrencies earlier. That one is key because Trump has already shown he's got some support in the crypto base. Musk has just donated to him. He loves crypto as well, and it's very much in the public domain. You've got people at home trading cryptos all the time. They love it. So that trade probably got legs as well.
Okay, the retail trade and the impact of Musk, again, coming out in support of President Trump. 62,692. Mark Cranfield, MLive strategist, on how the markets are adjusting, again, to the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. Mark, thank you very much indeed. Now, Donald Trump has arrived in Milwaukee for the Republican National Convention after he was targeted, of course, in that assassination attempt during a rally on Saturday. The US Secret Service now facing intense public scrutiny and several investigations. Meanwhile, President Biden has urged unity and condemned violence in a rare Oval Office address.
In America, we resolve our differences at the battle box. You know, that's how we do it, at the battle box, not with bullets. The power to change America should always rest in the hands of the people, not in the hands of a would-be assassin.
For more on this, I'm joined by Bloomberg's John Harney. John, what is the latest then as we look to the start of the RNC, of course, in Milwaukee?
Well, former President Trump has arrived in Milwaukee at a time of great drama and trauma in the United States. This is, of course, the first assassination attempt since the one on Ronald Reagan back in 1981. So people are still reeling. At the same time, the Republicans are prepared to wage to continue to wage the campaign, even if they seem to be trying to tone down the rhetoric a bit. They will present their program, the agenda focusing on inflation and immigration, of course, but it seems to be, at least for now, that perhaps with a little less vehemence.
John, what do we know in terms of the probes, the investigation, the criticism, by some at least, of the Secret Service for the lapses, the gaps in security? What is happening on that front? How does that adjust? How does that change the security around both candidates going forward?
Well, it certainly what happened raised a great many questions. How did the gunman get so close to so prominent a political figure, particularly after we've had some decades in the past these other terrible acts of violence and threats of violence. So there are going to be investigations in Capitol Hill. President Biden has pledged an independent inquiry. So there will be answers, of course, but right now, this was certainly it was certainly fortunate that this wasn't a lot worse. It was tragic, of course. One of the spectators at the rally was killed. At least one other was injured. And again, this was a traumatic event.
Okay. Bloomberg's John Harney, thank you very much indeed for the latest. Let's get more details, more analysis right now on this story and bring in Marco Vicenzino, who is Director and Global Strategy Advisor of Global Strategy Project. Marco, thanks so much for joining us. Is it your assessment, and you can push back on this, of course, but is this a watershed moment in this election campaign?
Yes, symbolically, pragmatically, I think in every sense of the word. What we have so far, for the past years, I've been speaking at business forums, and what I keep emphasizing is expect the unexpected. Not even the best script writers in Hollywood can come up with the narrative of events that have happened or will continue to happen towards Election Day. there are many risks on the road. I think above all, the political leadership is needed. President Biden came out with rhetoric of reconciliation, as did President Trump immediately afterwards. And this is not just for the political leadership in America to tone down the rhetoric, but also from ordinary citizens. There needs to be a reassessment of this whole campaign election process. That it's a process that you have to do from responsible leadership from the top down and from the bottom up. What I mean by that, it's a collective effort to try to calm down the rhetoric. The political polarization's there. It won't. It's taken years to develop, and it's not going to disappear overnight. However, the alternative is what? Is a further into the abyss. So I think the American political leadership across the spectrum and ordinary American citizens need to reassess the situation and come to their senses to prevent this from getting even worse. Now, politically, Trump will benefit from this. He'll have momentum going into the convention, and what he's trying to do is build that momentum over time. Remember, there was the debate, Biden's terrible performance. There's also a Supreme Court decision. Now is this issue with the attempted assassination. He's going to be picking his vice presidential candidate, and he needs to continue this momentum to build what you call the momentum of inevitability of victory over time, whereby you disincentivize your opposition. On his side, for Biden, this, I think, provides a temporary reprieve for him politically. Obviously, there's been strong calls within his party for him to step down and to get someone younger to, once again, to his mental capacity, physical capacity, age, bottom line. And the issue, his party is divided. There's been a brewing civil war within the Democratic Party in recent days, particularly after the debate. So I think for him right now, he needs to consolidate his position from his own perspective going into the Democratic convention at the end of August.
To what extent, Marco, and you kind of nod to this, to what extent does this neuter some of the attack lines of Biden, of the Democrats, in terms of the threat, and they've characterized Trump as a threat to democracy? Is that neutered in the short term, or is that neutered long term as you lead up to November? To what extent does this handicap the Democratic Party in a sustained way leading up to November?
That was one of the strongest, the quote-unquote Biden's point on Trump being a threat to democracy. On that point, he has to now, at least for the foreseeable immediate future, you can say for the immediate future, he has to calm down on that. Because once again, he's even put a hold on many of his political ads that may last only a few days. And that's a reaction to the attempted assassination. The question is that can he extend it in the long term? I think much of that has to depend. He's going to be more reactive. If Trump gets aggressive with his rhetoric and doesn't tone down his own rhetoric, and I think the Democrats will try to use that to adjust the volume accordingly. So I think on that attack, that specific point, Trump being a threat to democracy, that'll be conditioned upon what President Trump, his rhetoric is in the coming days and weeks and months ahead, heading towards Election Day.
Yeah. And Marco, just to be clear, I mean, markets are pricing in now a Trump victory in November. And you would say that is not irrational. You would say that is where things are pointing right now.
If it was to be held, the election at this very moment, yes. But between now and Election Day on November 5th, anything is possible. Remember, that thing is expect the unexpected. This is a day-by-day, week by week. You can even call it minute by minute and hour by hour, specifically after that attempted assassination of President Trump. So one needs this thing. Things are in flux. It's a wild swinging pendulum. But if the momentum continues for Trump as is, day by day, week by week, and month by month, yes, he's in a better position. The polling is to his advantage. The national polling, and what's even more important, is his lead in the swing state polling. What they're trying to do is to also use this event to also create a sympathy vote for many independent voters to bring to their side, because ultimately it'll be a few thousand independent voters in 7 key swing states that will determine the outcome of this election.
Yeah. OK, Marco Vicenzino, thank you very much indeed. Really smart analysis. Director and Global Strategy Advisor of Global Strategy Project on the implications, electoral implications, of course, of this attempted assassination attempt on the former President Trump. Coming up, China surprises with a miss on second quarter GDP growth just ahead of its biggest policy meeting in 6 years. We bring you the details next. And, of course, the policy implications for China on a Trump victory are important as well. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. OK, let's check in on how Asian markets are shaping up so far this Monday. Cross over to Avril Hong standing by in Singapore. Avril, it seems to be a bit of a mixed picture so far on the Asian session.
Yeah, it's mixed, and there are two things that we are watching this part of the world, the so-called Trump trade, as well as the reaction to the big miss from China data earlier today. And we're seeing, as investors seem to be ramping up their bets that we'll see a Trump presidency following the attack over the weekend, the Korea defense, nuclear, crypto stocks are gaining ground. The offshore yuan is weaker, though not by much. Of course, we know how the currency is sensitive to Trump's prospects, and we're seeing maybe the declines being capped by the PBOC today, sending a signal via the yuan fix that it doesn't want volatility on a week where the third plenum is underway. But of course, as I say, it's about the China data. The Chinese consumer, the tech stocks are the ones that are a big drag on the Hang Seng. That is the underperformer today. Flip the board. Let's recap what we got from the data out of Asia's largest economy. It was a big miss on the Q2 GDP growth, slowest pace in 5 quarters. The pain point is in the retail sales number. It missed all economists' projections. We saw big declines in the automobiles as well as the cosmetics consumer sector, showing you that weak demand and perhaps how the third plenum needs to come through with confidence-boosting measures, though we've been told time and again, manage your expectations because that's not quite the platform. It's more for laying out longer-term policy priorities. Tom?
OK, Avril Hong in Singapore, thank you very much indeed. We'll stay on that story then in terms of the economic data coming out of China and the plenum that is being set up, of course, for this week. Really important in terms of the political event and potential policy coming out of Beijing. China's latest economic data, though, showing the GDP growth weakening more than expected, as Avril was saying, to 4.7%, I should say, in the second quarter, falling short of expectations. Let's bring in Bloomberg's chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel, in Hong Kong. Stephen, what stood out to you then from this data set?
Obviously, those consumption numbers, the retail sales, 2%. We were expecting 3.4%. We already knew that confidence is pretty weak in the household level and consumption is pretty constrained right now. This really emphasized and underlined that point. And again, it points to the plenum that is starting today, the third plenum of the 20th Party Central Committee, which generally, looks at forward economic planning. And no one's really expecting big bang policy. But now we're kind of wondering, well, what is needed to get these numbers up? Because they're right now under pace for that around 5% GDP growth for the full year at 4.7%. We're expecting 5.1%. And property is obviously the big drag, and that ties back to household confidence as well, where about 2/3, upwards of 70% of household wealth is tied to property. And we know now, with even new home prices today dropping for a 13th consecutive month over month in June. So really, where are they going to find the new drivers of growth is where we will pivot now in this confluence of situations with a weak economy. And now, as we've been talking about all morning there, Tom, the prospects perhaps of another Trump presidency. I'm sure as they're meeting in Western Beijing right now, behind closed doors, the nearly 400 Central Committee members with Xi Jinping at the top chairing this meeting of the third plenum over the next 4 days, I'm sure they're kind of buckling up right now and trying to recalibrate their algorithms about what is going to take to find growth when domestic confidence is weak, property sector cannot get out of its slump, and now the export and the geopolitical situation could be upended again with Trump coming in, pledging 60% across the board tariffs on all Chinese exports or imports to the United States. So a lot of question marks. We're not going to get much news flow out of the plenum. It's closed door. And we're going to get a communique at the end of Thursday, I believe. And then we have to look forward to the 5th plenum, possibly in October, November, where we get potentially the next 5-year plan.
Yeah, as you say, an added risk for China's policymakers in an already challenged environment domestically, of course, and internationally. Stephen Engel, thank you very much indeed with the breakdown there coming through for us from Hong Kong. Coming up, President Biden urges unity, warning the nation is heading down a dangerous path after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. We are live in New York next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Let's get back to today's top story. Of course, the focus on Donald Trump, who has arrived in Milwaukee for the Republican National Convention, telling the Washington Examiner he has rewritten his speech to focus on unity. It comes after President Biden condemned political violence after the assassination attempt on Trump in Pennsylvania on Saturday. Very pleased to say, joining us now is Matt Winkler, Bloomberg's editor-in-chief emeritus, with the reaction from New York. And Matt, drawing on all of your experience, your contacts, of course, the business and political elite of the US. To what extent is this a watershed moment in this election? What is your take, your assessment of what we've been seeing, the dramatic moments that we've seen across the US, out of Pennsylvania in the last couple of days?
It's good to be with you. If you look at history as a guide, and that's a good place to start, there was an assassination attempt on FDR in 1933. There was an assassination attempt on President Truman. More recently, there were two assassination attempts within a month on President Ford. And then there was an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. None of those actually changed, if you will, the outcome in any significant way. So that's the historical record. And it probably gives us some, if you will, comfort that this event is not what some people might think it is, just because if you look at history, there have been more than several of these events, and they've been shocking, of course, but they haven't changed the trajectory. What is perhaps different this time is that Trump is running on an authoritarian platform, if you like, and he has been encouraging violence. We know that. And so America at this moment might be the least stable world power going into the election. But Biden, to his credit, actually did give a speech that was appropriate. There was nothing in it that was, if you like, offensive to anyone. It was all the right response to this horrible event. So I think it's premature to draw a conclusion that, as you said at the outset, that this may be a watershed event, because I don't think that's clear from any indication in history.
Yeah, that's really important nuance around what we've been seeing. But it is a democracy, as you suggest, that it is facing a clear challenge, isn't it? You've been looking at the democracy, I know, with a lens that has also faced its own challenges, but maybe is in more robust health than some might think, and that is South Africa. Talk to us about the linkages between the capitalistic function and the democratic changes, the political adjustments we've seen in South Africa. Maybe, possibly, if there are any lessons to be learned, just briefly, Matt.
Yeah, well, look, I'm so glad you asked that question, only because being Bloomberg, we leave it to markets to give us if you like, the best signal in all the noise. And if you look at the bond market right now, it's proving that democracy is a capitalist tool, at least in the case of South Africa. Nowhere is that truer in South Africa, where Rand-denominated securities are #1 in the world. They're giving investors a total return of 17%. That's about as good news story as you're going to get.
I'm very sorry, running short of time. Really apologise. Matt Winkler, Bloomberg's editor-in-chief emeritus. Plenty more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda. Donald Trump arrives in Milwaukee for the Republican National Congress after surviving an assassination attempt. The Secret Service protecting the former president, now facing intense scrutiny and investigations. President Biden calls for national unity in a rare Oval Office address, urging Americans to resolve their differences with ballots, not bullets.
There's no place in America for this kind of violence, for any violence ever. Period. No exceptions. We can't allow this violence to be normalized.
The dollar strengthens, Treasury futures fall as the shooting increases bets on Trump winning in November. We bring you the market reaction as the Trump trade heats up. Let's check in on those markets then, the adjustments that we are seeing on the back of that assassination attempt and what it means for the election in the US in November. Yes, the odds have increased, according to many at least, of a Trump victory in November. There remain, of course, significant caveats to that, but the broad top-line assessment seems to suggest that Trump will benefit from this, at least in the here and now. We're going to get more details, of course, with his speech at the RNC that takes place in Milwaukee. Currently, FTSE 100 futures pointing lower by 0.2%. European stocks that posted decent gains of a little over 2% last week, looking to losses currently at 28 points, down 0.6%, just shy of 0.6%. S&P futures, though, is a different picture. You're looking at gains for the S&P of 13 points, pointing higher by 0.2%. Nasdaq futures looking to add 73 points. Let's flip the board and look at the Treasury markets, the moves around the dollar and crypto as well, because Bitcoin has become something of a litmus test of the prospects of former President Trump in those November elections. Bitcoin at 62,813, a gain of 4.5% on expectations that should he win in November, he will be more supportive of that ecosystem. The Bloomberg Dollar Index also bid to the detriment of some of its currency pairs, currently up 0.1%. Bond futures then pointing lower by 0.2%. We can expect a move higher in yields when the trading resumes. Gold at 2,413, just up 0.1%. So President Biden urging unity, condemning violence in a rare Oval Office address following Saturday's assassination attempt on Donald Trump at a rally in Pennsylvania. The U.S. Secret Service now facing harsh public scrutiny and investigations after the shooting. Republican Senator Ron Johnson, one of several senior lawmakers, calling for transparency on the security failure.
When it comes to our oversight role, we'll have to do oversight in this. I mean, we'll let the FBI, the Department of Justice, Secret Service do their investigation, but then we should be demanding full transparency. My staff has already written a letter that we'll send, preservation of record letters. I mean, they have to be completely transparent, and they haven't been in the past.
OK, Ron Johnson speaking there. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Bill Furries now for the latest. Bill, what is the state of play in the two campaigns following this shooting?
Well, what we've seen so far is certainly a coalescing of momentum behind former President Trump. The attempted assassination and the imagery that came out of that has really rallied his core supporters. Online and through fundraising, they are backing him more strongly than ever. And of course, this all happened at a time when the Democratic Party was in real disarray about whether President Joe Biden should continue to be their nominee. That was the dominant story before the weekend. That's been eclipsed by the attempted assassination and the upcoming Republican National Convention. But the Democratic problems are still there, and it's something they will have to continue to address. So the momentum currently is definitely behind former President Trump. That said, we're a little less than 4 months away from Election Day, as we've seen in this campaign, from the debacle over the Biden debate and the indictment of President Trump. There have been a lot of key issues that have happened. Whether any of those are front and center behind voters in November remains to be seen.
And we do have the start of the Republican National Convention kicking off in Milwaukee, as we've been describing. And both sides, and you've touched on this, Democrats and the Republicans, so far at least, urging for cool heads, given the tensions now that we see rippling across the US. On the back of this, what can we expect? Does that hold at the RNC? What can we expect to be the set piece event and how all of that transpires in the next few days?
Well, I think, the U.S. has been very polarized for a number of years. I would not expect these calls for unity to last too long. We already know that Democrats are going to resume campaigning that they put on pause by Tuesday. In terms of the RNC event that kicks off Monday in the United States through Wednesday, the big things are going to be now, of course, President Trump's any public appearances he makes, any news about how his condition and the investigation into the shooting. But also he has a major decision to make, and it's not clear if he's settled on it yet, and that will be who his vice presidential running mate is. So that's something that has to take place by Wednesday when the various states do their roll call votes. So President Trump, former President Trump, has just a little over 48 hours to make that decision, and that will be a key moment for him in his campaign going forward.
OK, the VP pick for Trump in focus. Bloomberg's Bill Ferries, thank you very much indeed for the latest and looking ahead, of course, to the start of the Republican National Congress. Now, world leaders were quick to condemn political violence and wish Donald Trump a speedy recovery after the shooting of the former president over the weekend. Let's get more on the international response to that attempted assassination from Bloomberg's Oliver Crook. Ollie, what has then the reaction been from leaders across the globe?
Yeah, Tom, obviously this is a sort of thing that would send shock across the world. The stability of the United States is obviously paramount for every single country on the planet. And the leaders, as you say, across the planet, basically quickly to say that they send their condolences to Trump and their sympathies. But really the main messages across all is that violence is not the solution to political problems. You heard that from a number of different leaders, including Olaf Scholz, saying that the attack on the U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump is despicable. Such acts of violence threaten democracy. Though, of course, this was not the universal message across all of the different countries. And so we sort of take our focus to certain ones in particular. China gave a very sort of sober message of sympathy, saying that they're very concerned about the shooting incident. But we also go to the Kremlin, where we heard from the spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, saying that we do not believe that the attempt to eliminate and assassinate Trump was organized by the current authorities, i.e. President Biden, but the atmosphere around candidate Trump provoked what America is confronting today. Now, that is obviously the message from Russia taken with a grain of salt. However, it is a sentiment that has been echoed by other leaders from across the world. You had Javier Milei in Argentina saying that the desperation of the international left is not surprising, that it's willing to sort of to not lose at the polls by resorting to terrorism. You had Nigel Farage in the UK saying that the narrative that has been put around Trump by these liberals that oppose him is so nasty, so unpleasant, that he thinks it almost encourages this kind of behavior. So you had some of those messages, similar things from Geert Wilders over in the Netherlands. But really, for these global leaders, it's a question of stability in the United States and really how it's going to bear on who is going to be sitting across from them come January.
Yeah, so I mean, as you say, look, Milei and the Russians kind of tying in and pointing to and stirring up kind of some of these conspiracy theories. So we should, of course, look at those in that particular light. The political violence, of course, that we've seen in the US, and it's been quite pronounced. There's been analysis of the tick up that we've seen in recent years. Not just a concern, of course, on US soil. This is a concern facing other nations across the world.
Absolutely, Tom, and stable democracies. I mean, you had obviously the Trump attempt is the sort of highest profile and maybe sort of one of the more consequential things that we've seen in a while. But we saw Robert Fico of Slovakia, the prime minister, was shot just 2 months ago. You had a candidate in Korea who was stabbed earlier this year. These are all things that are of major concern. And in Germany specifically, there's been nothing quite as high profile. But in the lead up to the European elections, there were a number of acts of political violence, really attacks on politicians, including the former mayor of Berlin. You saw all of these sort of swell up. And again, according to the sort of German government, you've seen these acts go up to 60,000 offenses last year. Back in 2022, it set a record for politically motivated acts of violence. And again, back in 2023, set another record. This is all obviously very concerning because those numbers have almost doubled over the last 10 years. And really, this all comes into relief for us here in Germany because we have state elections here in September in 3 regions across Germany. And the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right group, where there's a lot of concern around some of this political violence, are expected to sweep all 3 of those regions. So in Germany, it's very much front and center.
OK, Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Berlin with the international perspective on, of course, this attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. Really important context coming through from Oliver Crook. Thank you. Now, switching focus, Goldman Sachs is in the spotlight today with second quarter results out later. Bank of America, Morgan Stanley report tomorrow. Let's get more from Bloomberg's Charlie Wells, of course, has been breaking down the results that have come through from some of the big lenders already. Let's start with where the focus will be then, Charlie. Good morning. When it comes to Goldman Sachs.
So really all eyes are going to be on investment banking revenue. And the question really here is, we we know that that's probably going to be very strong. What we saw in previous reports from Citigroup, from JP Morgan, was that investment banking revenue actually beat expectations significantly. But I think the question for Goldman, of course, which has that reputation for being an investment banking powerhouse, do they have momentum going into the second half? I think we've all been talking about how, the deal pipeline is a lot stronger, but does management give kind of better guidance than maybe we have expected? I think that's what everyone's going to be focusing on.
Yeah, is this going to be one and done, or is the momentum there for more, as you say? What else are you going to be looking for this week then? How is it going to be stacking up for you and the team as you try to get a grip of the earnings story when it comes to finance and the banks?
Tom, we're in the eye of the earnings story, so we're about halfway through, probably by the end of today. And look, we've got Bank of America coming on Tuesday. Management there has said that net interest income, which is another huge metric we've been looking at, that could actually be in a trough for the second quarter. So let's see how that spells out, if they've set expectations and if that hurts their share price. And then for Morgan Stanley, speaking of share prices, they've been underperforming relative to a lot of their peers. Let's see if that investment banking gives them a boost, and also if markets, which of course have been on a tear, if that helps their trading, if that helps their asset and wealth management divisions.
Yeah, and we see how they can be vulnerable, these banks, if they miss on the earnings front, with Wells Fargo sinking, 6% after a miss on net interest income last week. Charlie Wells with a preview of Goldman Sachs later today and the rest of the banking earnings coming out this week. Thank you very much indeed for the breakdown. Now, the Financial Times, sticking with Goldman Sachs, says Goldman Sachs is appealing its results in the Federal Reserve's latest stress test, which would require the bank to hold more capital. According to their sources, the move comes after CEO David Solomon said the result did not reflect Goldman's efforts to make its business more stable. And Bloomberg has learned that Alphabet is in talks to acquire cybersecurity startup Wiz. We're told the transaction could total as much as $23 billion, making it the Google parent company's largest acquisition to date. Last week, Alphabet reportedly shelved efforts to acquire customer relationship management firm HubSpot. Coming up, how has the attempted assassination of Donald Trump altered the political landscape then ahead of the US election in November? We're going to be speaking to David Dunn, international politics professor at Birmingham University. That is next. This is Bloomberg.
We may disagree. We are not enemies. We're neighbors. We're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're fellow Americans. We must stand together. Yesterday's shooting at Donald Trump's rally in Pennsylvania calls on all of us to take a step back. Take stock of where we are, how we go forward from here.
US President Joe Biden, of course, speaking from the Oval Office after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump on Saturday. Joining me now for more context on this is David Dunn, international politics professor at Birmingham University. Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. How do you characterize this moment in US politics?
I think this will be an iconic moment. Those images will go down the ages. The attempted assassination has the potential to be an inflection point in this election campaign. It will certainly be a huge boost for the popularity of Donald Trump. That defiant, vigorous response that he had on the lectern stage was one which will resonate with his supporters, who will have a greater admiration for him all the more. When Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981, his opinion poll numbers went up to 70% approval as a consequence of the sympathy and indeed the way he dealt with it. Reagan joked to his wife that he forgot to duck. He joked with the surgeons, "I hope you're Republicans." And that got him a huge boost. We can expect a similar thing, slightly different reasons, for Donald Trump. So going into this convention, his popularity will go up enormously. We can expect a huge boost in fundraising on the back of this. We can imagine that image on every T-shirt and mug on sale at that convention and on websites. Whether that lasts is the bigger question, and partly that comes down to really how the response is managed. So far, Trump has been magnanimous unanimous. Others in the Republican Party haven't and have made this a partisan issue by attacking the Democrats for the way in which they've characterized Trump in this campaign, blaming him. So J.D. Vance and others have done that sort of thing. So really whether it unites the country is open to question yet.
Well, on that point then, cool heads have so far prevailed in terms of the leadership, at least, from Trump, from Biden. Is it your expectation, given recent history, that those cool heads do prevail? Or are you concerned that the rhetoric returns to the divisiveness that we've seen in the past and frankly, some dangerous rhetoric as well coming from sides?
I think that in the age of Twitter, where everyone has feels the obligation to respond, what we've got is a whole range of fairly angry responses to this. But also, actually, since Donald Trump entered this campaign in 2016, there has been an underlying aspect or threat of a mood of violence. And there's several reasons for that. He is someone who hasn't prioritized, in a democracy, you prioritize the process and not the result. That Donald Trump has approached this in a different way. He's refused to accept the result of the election. He said this back in 16, even before the result was known. Of course, on that occasion he won. And what that means is when you don't respect the process and you don't condemn violence in the way that Donald Trump hasn't condemned violence, what that means is it creates a permissive environment for that. He's referred to the jailed rioters on January 6th as hostages, as heroes, as incredibly patriotic. In that fervent environment, what you do is you create a permissive environment for violence.
To what extent does this sideline the whole debate around Joe Biden's suitability, the concern about his age, or does that resurface?
I think what it does is it delays it, because you wouldn't want the Democrats wouldn't want to be seen to be acting against Biden in the same time frame as the reaction to the assassination attempt, because they wouldn't want those events to be linked, for the Democrats to be seen to be panicking. But it doesn't make the issue go away, because the gap in the polls will increase. The issues over Biden's competence will continue. Whether the Democrats are now culled into stepping back from that, or whether they actually see that as an imperative, really is too difficult to say. My inclination is that this issue will come back, because Biden has no path back to a plan for victory, and therefore the Democrats will come to the calculation that they are better off with a different candidate going against Trump in November, rather than the one who is in many ways irreparably damaged by the debate performance and the press gaffes at the press conference.
Professor, what else are you going to be watching for in the days ahead in terms of how the polling numbers could adjust as we focus on what is essentially a handful of swing states and a few thousand voters?
Well, what's been interesting up until now is, as you say, those 6 key swing states have been regarded as pivotal. But what's interesting, and one of the reasons why the Democrats are really concerned about the candidacy of Joe Biden, is that the numbers are slipping across the board. States that have been seen for 2 or 3 years as solidly democratic are moving towards the lean democratic phase, and therefore there's a real danger that the Democrats could lose not just in those 6 swing states, but across the board. And what that means is that they would lose the House and the Senate too. And for that reason, that issue of Biden's future will come back into play, because there is a danger for the Democrats that this actually comes to be a landslide and gives Trump a Trump presidency unparalleled power. He already has control of the Supreme Court, and that would change the calculation quite considerably.
Professor, really appreciate your analysis and your take on what has unfolded, of course, historic events out of the US. David Dunn, International Politics Professor at Birmingham University. Thank you. There's plenty more coming up. We stay, of course, focused on the market reaction to this assassination attempt and how this unfolds going forward. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now, of course, the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump has had an impact and is likely to have an impact in terms of the voter reaction. And that is why you're also seeing a reaction in the markets as they adjust around this and start to take bets, further bets on a Trump presidency in November. There is still, of course, 4 months to go. But in terms of the reaction, in terms of sentiment, here is an interesting gauge coming from predictit.org. You can pull this up on your Bloomberg terminal right now, but look at this crocodile mouth shape in terms of the support and the market expectations around a Trump presidency, the increase on the back of this assassination attempt versus Joe Biden, and of course who's facing his own challenges given that debate about his age and suitability in light of that question. We keep continuing to monitor this, of course, but this links into the market moves that we're seeing. We can flip the screen and have a look at the terminal chart that shows the moves around these markets, the positioning in terms of the US Treasury story, but also in terms of the US dollar. And you're seeing that pronounced today. Treasuries are not yet trading, but futures are suggesting a sell-off and possibly a bear steepening with buying at the front end, selling at the long end. The Trump administration, if it comes to pass, and if that vote comes through in his favour in November, still a big if, of course, would, on many counts, be inflationary. And so you'd expect, at least at the long end of the Treasury curve, some selling there and yields up. In terms of the dollar move, then, we have seen that pronounced in the session so far today. And you're seeing a little bit of pressure coming through on euro, seeing a bit of pressure coming through on yen and other pairs around the Bloomberg dollar index on expectations that higher yields is supportive for the dollar. If we get to that elections result in favour of Trump in November. Interesting to see crypto as well and the bid for Bitcoin on the back of the events on Saturday. Switching focus and quite a pivot right now, but to support, because it was a huge weekend for sport as well, overshadowed, of course, by the events in the US. But it was quite a Sunday for Spain, worth mentioning from a sporting context. The nation's football team, of course, defeating England 2-1 to capture a record fourth championship in Berlin. England's men's team once again denied its first major trophy since the 1966 World Cup. Coming up on Bloomberg TV, Fed Chair Jerome Powell speaking to Carlyle co-founder and peer-to-peer host David Rubenstein at the Economic Club in Washington. That's at 5:30 p.m. London time. You will not want to miss that. And you won't want to miss the opening trade. That is up next. This is Bloomberg.